Hey folks, welcome back. This week we're really digging into history of diet sources to get a sense of what diet texts were like in the 1700s and 1800s. And it seems like a different universe going that far back in time for diet. But as we saw with Galen, there's an odd consistency about dietary advice. And so the language sounds different. Obviously, there's different things going on in the world, but a lot of the core of dietary advice, a lot of the ideas that people had about diet and health, the way they gave advice, the way they established expertise, has a lot of continuity over time. So we're looking at the 1700s and 1800s this week with a really strong focus on looking at texts from that time period. One reason we're reading these texts is that they're so immediately accessible. You can read just a few pages and get a sense of how the author and the intended audience thought about diet and health. That's not always the case for historic sources that take more contextualization. You're not sure what to make of things. This is dietary advice. It's a genre we're all familiar with. Also, seeing how authors present themselves, how they establish expertise, seeing what their ideas are about diet, why you should do this, not the other thing, how they're trying to communicate about the relationship between diet and health. This is a great way, one of the best ways, I think. I'm a little biased, but a great way to understand not only the historical period, in 1700s and 1800s this week, but anytime. They tell us a lot about our own ideas about health. I mentioned this, I think, in the introductory video. I think it's really powerful way of reflecting on our own dietary culture, the way we think about diet and health, looking at text from a different world. When we think about, okay, why did they think about those things the way they did? And then we think about, well, why do we think about the things that we do? Why do we do them in a certain way? When we can understand them a little bit, we can understand ourselves a little bit more. So this week we're diving into a bunch of primary sources. Compared to Galen, the texts we're reading are much less about individual foods themselves. They do that, but we're not really reading those sections. They're much more about dietary philosophy. Like what is the link between diet and health? And you get a sense of how people thought about diet and what it was. And we're not reading these. I want to be super clear. We're not reading these texts because the dietary advice itself is super important to us. We're looking for the bigger picture, okay? What kind of advice is the author giving? How do they conceptualize health? What is that for them? How does food relate to that? How do they talk to their reader? What kind of personality do they have? How do they establish their expertise? Who are they talking to? What problem are they trying to solve? What do they think is wrong with their reader? Just a quick word on terminology. I've used this term primary source. Primary source means a text written in a historical period that we're studying, right? So we were studying Galen before we read Galen. We're studying the 1700s and 1800s this week. So we read texts from then, okay? So those are our primary sources, the original historical document. They could be really old, 1800 years old, like Galen's. They could be much more recent. Primary sources don't have to be old. It's just the primary thing that you're analyzing. So if we did a project together on 21st century dietary texts, dietary manuals, TikTok videos, whatever the medium might be, if we're trying to understand 21st century diet, everything in the last 25 years would be our primary sources, right? So they don't have to be old necessarily, but it's the stuff you're studying. In historian speak, secondary sources are the stuff that historians write that are analyzing the primary sources. It's what historians have said about the past. And maybe this is a great little caveat moment here where I can make sure you're aware of the distinction between the past and history. And we use these interchangeably in English, and so you probably do too. I do. Everybody does it. It's fine. But they are different, and sometimes that's useful to keep in mind when we're going through a course like this. The past has happened, okay? It's over. It's gone. We don't know much about what happened. Okay, if you've been to a party, you ask five different people what happened, you'll get five completely different versions, right? Depending on what they saw, what they were interested in. Same event, same people, same place, same time, totally different stories, right? You've all experienced that in one way or another, right? So we don't really know definitively much about the past, but we have lots of clues. We have texts, we have other sources, we have lots of different things where we can study kind of what we think happened and make sense of it. That's the fun of history, is making sense of what happened in the past. But the history, as distinct from the past, the stuff that happened. The history is the stories we tell about the past. Historians have a role to play in that, but they're not the only people who create stories about the past. The things we say about the past, that's history. That's the living thing. It changes, right? Why do we keep writing books about the same people, over and over again? It's because they serve a different purpose. Books about Darwin written in 1900 are serving a different purpose than books about Darwin this year. Okay. Not a hugely different purpose, but we have a different sort of spin on. My hope is by the end of this course that you have a sense of history of diet and health through both primary and secondary sources, right? So you know what the original people were saying, right? We're only skimming like this tiny, tiny little thin section of what people published. Okay, obviously there's only so much you can do in 4 weeks, but I'm trying to give you a sample of these different kinds of things so you have a sense of what it was really like. What did people really say about diet and health? But then we also have the secondary sources, the historians who are analyzing that and giving opinions and synthesis and kind of making sense of it. And then I guess this class is kind of like a tertiary source. It's like a synthesis of the secondary and the primary, and it's like a triptych of things. I don't know. It doesn't matter. What's on tap this week? Monday and Tuesday, we're looking or skimming sort of an article about dietary expertise in the Enlightenment. So this article is kind of geared around 1700 to 1750. There's kind of a 2 day set here. Monday and Tuesday go together. So on Monday, we're reading this long academic article about this physician named George Cheyne, who lived in the first half of the 1700s. He's a cool guy. The article explains it, introduces him, so I'll leave that to the article. It's long, it's kind of boring. It's boring for me, and I love this stuff. Okay, so I'm presuming it's not like super exciting for you. If it is, awesome. Just read the whole thing. But here's what I think we should do. We're going to use AI to summarize the article for us. So you have the PDF in Zotero, you can download it. You should upload it to some AI tool. Doesn't matter which one. I've used ChatGPT the most, so that works fine. You can use whatever you want. Okay. You shouldn't have to pay for anything because all these services give you this basic functionality for free. You might have to create an account if you don't have one, but I'm sure all of you have some AI experience at this point. Anyway, upload the article, ask for a summary. You'll see the summary is not bad. It actually sounds really good, but it's also, as someone who's familiar with the article, it's not great. Okay. So your job in this class is to reconcile. Do the AI summary, then skim through the article. You don't have to read it carefully or closely, okay? There's not time for that. But try to find, this is your job, to find the places where the AI has sort of skimmed too much or misrepresented something, right? Especially bigger picture ideas. There'll be some details in the summary that don't seem important. You'll find details in the actual thing that come up over and over again. You're like, how come this isn't in the summary, right? So that's what I'm asking you to do is reconcile the summary with the actual article. Also, part of your assignment is to relate this text to the rest of the stuff we've read so far, right? How does it fit into the narrative of the class? Okay, AI can't really help you with that. So make sure you know the article well enough to explain how it fits into what we're doing here. The article is about establishing expertise in the Enlightenment. And the physician, George Cheyne, is really a fascinating case study in how this happens. So have fun with that. On Tuesday, we're looking at how the sausage gets made, really. We're looking at how history gets written, right? History is distinct from the past. Okay, so on Monday, you're reading this article about George Cheyne. On Tuesday, you're reading Cheyne's book on diet for yourself, right? Or at least skimming parts of it. The book is really long. We're reading just a couple of sections that are highlighted on the syllabus. So your job on Tuesday, analyze how well you think Chapin, who wrote the article for Monday, is representing this text. Because when we read a modern historian talking about a text or a set of text, everything seems so obvious. There's a story waiting to be told. But that's the historian doing a lot of analysis and doing a lot of selection and doing a lot of cutting and doing a lot of prioritizing, right? And trying to make sense of what is actually kind of messy. So we're going to look at Cheyne's own writing, and you're going to comment on how you feel about that conversion from the text that you're reading, which is confusing to say the least. You'll see that it matches kind of what we read on Monday, but it's different. It's a really different thing. And when you see that and you compare it to Monday, then you can reflect on sort of, okay, how does a historian go from this kind of source to this kind of analysis, right? And that's what we're reflecting on for Tuesday. On Wednesday, I'm asking you to do a comparative analysis of a handful of texts. Primary sources written in the early 1800s. They're all about diet and health. I mean, that's like the title of all of these things. And I have a little video on how I want you to do that. You can skip that if you just want to dive in. But if you want a little bit more concrete guidance, please check that out. And that kind of walks you through a couple of the sources and shows you how I approach these and how I hope you will explore them a little bit just to do this comparison. So I'll leave that instruction to the video, but that's Wednesday. Thursday, we get to meet Sylvester Graham, who you've probably already interacted with if you've had a graham cracker, because he came up with this idea of this really, really plain sort of biscuit, this kind of plain wafer. And now when you think of graham crackers, you think of, cinnamon and sugar and marshmallows and other stuff. He would hate that, right? He wanted the plainest food. He was a religious and health reformer, lived kind of the first half of the 19th century, so 1800 to 1850 roughly. And he thought there was a very close coupling between moral and spiritual salvation and diet. And the way that you sort of cleansed your body and cleansed your soul was to eat a very plain, austere diet. No spices, salt, alcohol, obviously, nothing that was like vaguely fun. Like it had to be completely plain and boring. These graham crackers were like almost unedible by a modern palate. The chapter we're reading is from a book on vegetarianism in the US, kind of the story of vegetarianism. It's a really fascinating story. Unfortunately, a little too far afield from our diet and health focus. If we had more time, we could do it, but only 4 weeks. So we have to cut out some things. The chapter starts, I'm asking you to skim the first part because it starts talking about some biblical Christians and they coming to the US and starting one of the first vegetarian societies. And we don't care about them so much, but they were heavily influential for Sylvester Graham, who modeled a lot of his sort of dietary practices after and vegetarianism after what they just talked about. So the reading does a nice job of introducing Graham and his historical context, and that's the reason we're reading it. So when you see the biblical Christian stuff at the beginning, it's kind of a lead up to Graham, so you can skim through that a little faster. I'll leave the rest of the Graham introduction to the reading because it's quite good at that. On Friday, following our pattern this week, we're going to read Graham himself, and you get to understand sort of Graham's own thinking about diet and health and how he talked about it, how he established his expertise, what kind of dietary intervention he was trying to make. And this isn't actually Graham's own writing. He didn't actually write very much. He was more of a public lecture guy and would travel around giving these hugely attended public lectures on diet and health. I mean, he was a phenomenon in himself. And he had such a strong following. He had this like army of people who would go around and listen to his lectures and take notes and write things down. And they all sort of worked together to produce like text of his thinking, of his dietary advice and his sort of regimen for living and health and moral superiority and so on. Okay, there's no Google Docs, there's no email. I mean, this was a lot of work to consolidate this information, but they were so passionate about it. The Grahamites, they were called, people who followed him and promoted his thinking and his ideology. So I'm asking you to read this text. It's not exactly Graham's words, but it's stuff he says in the lecture, so it's close enough. I want you to think about how Graham builds off the text that we read earlier this week and kind of compare and contrast what's going on. Why is Graham writing the way he's doing it? How is it different from other stuff you've seen? What does that tell you about the evolution of diet text or progression of diet text in the 1800s? That's four. Two key features across the primary sources I want you to keep in mind for this week. First, note the very strong, I don't know why I'm counting here, it's not five. Okay, first, the very strong coupling between diet, health, and morality. This is a common thread throughout the rest of the course, this intersection of diet and morality. This is not surprising. We've seen this in Cheney to some extent, maybe a little bit in Galen as well. I want to propose, in fact, I'm just telling you, this sort of juxtaposition of diet, health, and morality never goes away, right? Even now, when you look at contemporary diet advice, it's not always explicit in the way that it is in the 1900s, but it's there. Somebody's telling you what you should eat, and it's so you're healthier, but often there's kind of this subtext of, well, you'd be a better person if you just didn't have as much junk food or whatever. And there's this kind of moral high ground that kind of comes into focus here and there, even in the most contemporary diet advice. Okay, so we see that really develop in the 1800s. It's still going as strong, not as obvious necessarily today, but that thread goes throughout. And we'll look at this next week as well. Okay, the other thing to keep in mind for readings this week is the historical context, which is kind of here and there in the readings, but let me just be real clear in one minute here. English Industrial Revolution starts around 1760s, gains steam, sorry, couldn't resist, throughout the 1700s, right? The world is fundamentally changing, right? People have a different relationship to farming, to agriculture, to food production, to food consumption, right? All the factories, the rail yards, transforming the English landscape. There's the green pastures and everything, the quintessential like early modern England, that's gone. And so we have a really different, I mean, in a lot of places, right? I mean, there's still pockets of, grass, but Mostly it's industrialized, right? It's dirty, it's sooty, it's smelly. It's about making stuff and shipping it, right? It's not about, you call it farming. Okay. And so people have to figure out what to eat and how to make food, right? And they're shipping food all over the world, right? The global British Empire is huge, right? We tend to forget how large it was now because they're just this little island. But this global empire needs to be fed, right? And they're bringing in beef from other places to feed their own people. The whole food world transforms. Okay, so people have this different question in mind that they've never had before. What is a natural diet? And this question actually shows up. Sorry, I'm getting into my own research here. I'm getting too excited. It shows up in the 1790s because people are asking, farmers are asking, what do I feed my animals? There's no pasture anymore. They have to buy food and give it to them. What are they supposed to do? So they're trying to figure out, what is the natural cycle? How much? Where do I get this stuff? What can I substitute if I can't get the original thing? So they're figuring out what is a natural diet for their animals. And of course, it's not very long before people start asking that question about people. Like, what is our natural diet? What are humans supposed to eat? Now that our food system isn't just subsistence. In 1700, what did you eat? Whatever you could get. But now it's an industrializing world. You can get a lot more stuff, right? And this trend obviously continues. So what do you eat, right? This question is not relevant when you don't have much choice, but choice is becoming far more prevalent now. And so now there's a question, what are we supposed to eat? Okay, that's enough context, I think, for this week. Just keep in mind the industrializing, changing world, the details don't matter, but this is why people are concerned about what to eat. And the diet, the new diet that's coming into the world is maybe not as healthy as people think that it could be. See you in the next one.